no, you don't just have to get stronger. There could be something else going on here. And not only just that, I may have to take away some of your weight room strength. Like I may have to take some of it away. Or I may have to help you take some of it away, I should say. My point is like that is a thing. Like some people are going to have to be like, nope, I don't care what your bench number is. Like we have to drop it back.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. Today, I'll be chatting with Dan Sanzo, personal trainer and strength and conditioning coach based in Boston, Massachusetts. Dan is the owner of Strategic Fitness Training, LLC, and is the associate director of sports performance at Northeastern University. He has over a decade of strength and conditioning experience in Division I college athletics, and prior to his career in the collegiate setting, he was a full-time athletic trainer. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so like I was saying just before, you were mentioned by Michelle Boland on a previous episode as the best trainer that nobody knows about. How does that sound to you?
I mean, she's sweet and that's very kind, but I'm sure there's a lot of very good trainers out there that no one is putting out their content or whatever it is. But I'm flattered, to say the least.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you on the podcast. I'm looking forward to digging into some of the concepts that you outline on your social media throughout this interview.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, let's start way back when we talk about sports and when you were a kid. So what was your favorite sport as a kid?
Oh, soccer. So I played soccer year round. I dabbled in other things, but for whatever reason, it was soccer. And I couldn't get enough of it all the way through, high school at least. And then at that point, there was that decision, like if you want to go to a certain size school or like, what do you do, like what level you want to play at. And it just wasn't worth it because I wanted to go to the bigger school and kind of move on from it a bit. But that's kind of what got me into, or it is what got me into all this is, I was battling injuries and I didn't understand why I was experiencing some things. Even when I started to really work out in high school to be a better athlete, I started to experience, pain and discomfort more so. And that's kind of what eventually led me on my path, if you really think about it.
What kind of injuries did you suffer back then?
I mean, early on, it was, things like shin splints. And then I'll never forget, I was in this soccer tournament where I strained one calf and I was like, I'm going to keep playing. And I ended up straining the other calf. And then I was just like shut down for a whole summer. That sucked. But like, it was all this lower body stuff, knee issues. It was mostly like from knees down in high school. And then like when I was past high school when I was training, and I was still like strength training very, very often, was when I started to experience other things. Like I tore my rotator cuff, I had hip impingement, I had all types of chronic issues as well, especially the knees. And again, that's what's kind of pushed me so much into looking into, why and why did I feel like I was experiencing all these things where, some of my buddies were not. And especially when I, supposedly was doing all the right stuff because I was the one always being active, right? I was the one that's always in the weight room. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
What do you, looking back now with hindsight and all the experience that you've gained, what do you attribute all those issues to?
It's a loaded question, but it's, if I think about it, it's, simply put, asymmetries. Now there's different models as I describe why that is. But I, in particular, and I'm still managing it right now, I had a cranial strain, which is a certain rotation in your skull, and it affects your whole spine down. That seemed to really impact me, and that's why I think I had a little bit more of these issues than others. And I've gone through extensive dental work and braces, and I literally just got braces off a month ago to help manage that. And I still have clear aligners now to help move teeth a little bit more to help manage that. But that aspect, and then if you follow the compression expansion model and the idea of a left precession that someone like Bill Hartman teaches, it was just unable to manage those, and then my strength training was promoting my strategies that I use even further. So the second I started managing those better, I feel a lot. I feel better now in my mid-30s than I did in my 20s. So,
Yeah, for people who don't know about what you talked about, what Bill Hartman teaches, the compression expansion model, can you talk a little bit about this and to kind of set the stage? Because it seems like a lot of what you do in terms of the work that you put out is based on at least on that framework as well as other ones, but it seems to be one of the major frames. So if you could define that a little bit so that people have a bit of context moving forward.
yeah, I mean, and I probably won't do it justice compared to how he would, but um, his model is really just about gradients and many things. But one is um, this compression expansion model where it's more about fluid shifts and fluid dynamics and kind of combining that with a biotensegrity model, which is pretty much everything in the body is connected from molecular level on up, and it's based off of very basic principles of physics. I mean, you combine all these things, it just means that essentially, well, a lot of we were taught in school, or at least, I mean, I'll speak for myself, like that guy anatomy, using basic geometry to try and measure how forces apply, isn't quite accurate enough for some of the things that we see and how we move. So when you start looking at it from a different lens, it kind of opens up doors for how things can occur a little bit more when you don't think this of like a pulley system. And then if you think about how fluid has to shift in the body to move a certain way, and that's kind of like a really watered down variation of it.
It makes sense. I was kind of introduced to that whole idea by Justin Moore when he came on the podcast, and he
Yeah.
was talking about change of direction, and he was able to integrate all of that into what he does, which I found really interesting. And then I went digging for some of Bill's videos and to try and kind of understand. I haven't found like the video where he explains it from like A to Z, so I've tried to pick up bits and pieces left and right. Did you get a chance to go work with him by any chance?
So I'm part of his mentorship program. So we speak often. I was a member of the intensive for when he was putting those on. I'm sure he will again once the COVID experience passes. So, that's got me, again, pretty in depth with the model, and by far the most useful one I found to explain the things I see and uh, help the people I kind of work with. That, again, I usually tend to work with people that have some limitations or some issues that they're trying to manage in particular.
Yeah. So what were the biggest kind of breakthroughs for you once you were first exposed to that model and started understanding all the pieces and what it involves? What were the major shifts in how you perceive things?
Um, a really big one, and I think I've always thought about to some degree. We always think about things being connected, and little by little, if I think about over the last, I've been coaching for like 17 years now, I started to see how more things were connected. And, initially it was okay, talk about the connect chain, and you start thinking about like polyarticular, strands and structures and how they move, and more getting into this one is when I really started to step back and just think about how everything is made out of the same stuff and how everything can adapt and change, if you want to call it changing shape. That opened up a lot of doors about how you can see motion occur certain ways. That was big. And then another big component of that, based off that, is when we start thinking about things as position and then we start thinking of things as muscle action. That, again, also explains how things are so detailed and why we may have to perform things in a very particular manner to correct or to, I'm sorry, not the right word, though, to give you the option to perform a thing a certain way or a certain motion a certain way. So those are really, really, really big ones. I say, again, just think about how motion can occur structurally from head to toe in some type of influence. I use like a spider web analogy when I talk to people, where I create a spider web and I pull on the very lower right side of that spider web. There will be a change throughout that whole spider web, right? The spot where I'm pulling at is going to have the biggest change, but there is some degree of changing occurring at every level, moving, across it. And that's similar how the body works. When it comes to compression expansion, you put it in one area, there is a ripple effect throughout the body. I think Bill uses the idea of, throw a stone in a pond and the ripples coming out from that, how they get smaller as you move away, but initially bigger. But that's a big piece to it. And then, like I said, the muscle action idea of how it's not just a muscle being concentric or eccentric. That's actually more about position. But when you're in those states, those positions, is the muscle overcoming or is it yielding to the forces that are applied? And when you start thinking of things that way, the possibilities of how we can perform things is greatly expanded.
Could you dig into that a little bit? It's a concept that I've read about, I've heard about, but I haven't quite grasped it. The idea of that idea that you just mentioned. Could you go in a little more detail?
Yeah, especially about like the eccentric concentric.
That one.
So if we think about a muscle and we give it an imaginary midpoint, and we say that imaginary midpoint, if we shorten it past to a certain degree past imaginary midpoint, we'll say it's biased towards concentric. If we lengthen it past that imaginary midpoint, we'll say it's biased towards eccentric. And that's just talking about the position of the muscle, where it is. Then on top of that, you could be in either position, and that muscle can be overcoming, which is what we've probably traditionally been told is like shortening or trying to shorten. And then it could be yielding, which is kind of giving way. So now we have this idea of you can be in a different position of I'll call it longer, right? And then trying to overcome, or longer and trying, and it is giving way. You could just think of doing a bicep curl, very top of it. If you flex your arm, your elbow, that's concentric. If I was up there and I was actually overcoming and my hand is moving towards my body, I'm concentric overcoming. If I start in that position where I have my elbow flexed and I am in a concentric position, but maybe the weight is so heavy that I'm actually lowering, and now I'm yielding from a concentric position. And at some point, I would transition into an eccentric position, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. What does that frame bring on top of just thinking about, oh, I'm moving? What is the I guess the starting position, like you said, whether you're concentric or eccentric as a kind of the starting position? What does that bring to the table as opposed to just talking about eccentric movement, concentric movement?
So then we have to give it context and I guess put you in a position. Maybe it's best to think of it as cutting if you look into a particular area of the body at the same time at that time. So it offers like degrees of what muscle action and position could be occurring during that motion, because it's not just a light switch, like you're there or not there, right? Mm-hmm. We just think in moments of time to help us understand. Mm-hmm. But let's say, like I talk a lot about actually like going into a cut and then on the transition out of a cut. That's actually that a lot of times we see those people that either pop up tall or turn like an aircraft carrier, is because they actually are missing a yielding quality in certain areas to help them transition in the turn. And they're actually trying to do the light switch, where they're trying to not have this gradual gradient of a turn. They're trying to just go from one spot to the other, and it pushes them out of control, essentially. And if we follow the same model, it's like actually about your internals, your guts, which I'm sure Justin Moore talked about a few weeks ago when he was on. It's about controlling that in this gradient fashion rather than it just getting pushed out of control in one way. So it comes into play in those aspects of how you kind of transition and move in one area, or when the pressure inside you is in one spot, and how do you manage it without making you use, in Bill's words, would be a compensatory strategy to try to do so, which would make you more rigid.
Yeah, that does make sense. I guess it adds degrees of detail to how looking at how someone moves and how someone is reacting to a certain, like you said, position or initial movement into something. Within that same model, you talk quite a bit about movement variability or movement potential. Yeah. So can you kind of go into this and talk about what it means?
Yeah. So if we think about a joint just having what it should have for a full excursion of motion, so you could think of the hip should have a full excursion of 100 degrees. You add up the internal rotation, external rotation. That is like your potential of ability to move, right? In that context you're using. And that one was just me talking about someone on a table. But that has a lot of significance because one, it can represent your whole system. So your ability to move through that full excursion can kind of tell you how your whole body is reacting in terms, if you want to call it stress levels or autonomic tone, what have you. But then if you have only a certain amount of movement variability, there's the potential to create compensatory strategies on top of that because you're trying to find a way to move when you don't have access to a certain area. Production are essentially opposite sides of a spectrum. So we want to limit movement variability if we're trying to create a lot of force. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, just think about a structure that had a lot of motion, it wouldn't be able to support a lot of force through it. I wrote something about if I had a stack of stones, right? If I had a stack of stones and those stones were all just loose bodies balancing on top of each other, it would take a lot more work to try to balance it. And obviously motions couldn't be as quick in whatever direction I kind of wanted to move that pile or stack of stones. But if I glued all those stones together, I could create much bigger motions and move my arm or move the pile much more vigorously to and still control that stack. Well, your joints are kind of similar, where if I have motion, I won't be able to create as much force, but again, it takes off pressure from the joints, and you kind of have this system. So going back to like that biotensegrity model, dampening forces and accepting all the forces. That's kind of what we're designed for. Versus if I lock up joint motion and decrease movement variability, I can produce more force. But it depends what we're doing, if we want that or not. Like, yeah, if I'm moving really heavy weights, yes. If I'm sprinting, there's gonna be definitely a degree of that. If I'm coming out of a cut, 100%. But again, it goes back into this whole timing point, concept and that's almost where this whole, where this whole concentric, eccentric, and then the actions of overcoming and yielding come into play to tell you when you need which one, really. But that's like the general overview is the spectrum of the two. And then how much someone needs, to me, is literally the key for what we do. There are certain sports that are very much biased towards force production, and maybe not even the sport, but then sometimes positions in that sport. And they need a ton of it. And that's why, traditional strength training works for them. But at the same time, there's always this, like, how much am I sacrificing in terms of movement variability to acquire that force? And that, in my mind, at least, is what keeps people healthy and able to continue to participate. That's one. And then two, it gives them people the option to actually have the ability to repeat efforts and the ability to respond to the context they're in. So repeatable efforts, you have to be able to recover between whatever high intensity event. Well, the more rigid you are, that's harder to do. If you have more movement variability, you probably can do it more often, but maybe you don't have as much force as you would like. So again, there's this degrees, like where do you want to be on the spectrum in terms of that? And then being able to respond, same thing. So, a track athlete, a 100-meter track athlete, sprinting is much different than a soccer player and what they have to go through. So yes, they both sprint at times, and yes, one's job is pretty much only sprinting. But that soccer player is in a much more chaotic environment. There's a lot more unknown in terms of how their body will have to position, will there be body contact, even the elements, right? Like the surface of the field, literally if it's raining or not, like these all add things to the context of their environment that they have to be able to respond to, and that may require certain positions and muscle actions to overcome those challenges. So if they are as rigid as that sprinter, they may not be as good of a soccer player, or maybe as
Versatile, maybe?
Yeah, I said they're not going to be as available maybe because maybe they
Right.
can go out and play one game, but right, I think be able to play a whole season, right? Because of that that ability to recover between those events. So again, it's just play between where someone has to be, and I have no idea what anyone's exact ratio is. It's one of those things where this field's an art, and I think you get to know the person. They all have their own idiosyncrasies and genetics and that come into play about how these two things interact. But the goal in my mind is to get to know them well enough to be like, okay, how much force do I think you need? Does it seem to be helping you? Are we still being able to participate, respond, get in and out of positions that we need to get in and out of? Because again, there's always this back and forth about how much. And some people can really do it well. Some people can't do it as well. Again, it's just up in the air, and that's where your assessment and getting to know a person really comes into play.
Yeah, the example that came to my mind is like a prop in a scrum playing rugby, where they have to produce massive amounts of force. It's not as straightforward as maybe like a back squat for a powerlifter, but it's still a lot of force. And although there is a lot of constraints in terms of variables pushing you left and right, forward and back because of how many people are involved in the thing, it's still like a high force kind of situation. But then they need to be able to get up, move around, and then be agile on their feet when they have to with the ball in hand. So that requires you, like you said, to kind of go through that full spectrum of on the one hand needing less mobility, right, to create more force, and on the other side you need that available again. So you need to kind of be able to switch from one to the other, which is an interesting concept to me, because I guess we hear a lot of mobility, but I guess it's all context dependent, right? When you're under, I don't know, a 600, 700 pound bar, you don't want to be mobile.
No, you do not. If you are, you'll be crushed, right? So
Yeah.
again, it's exactly what you said, and that's what it is. We're really literally creating adaptations, right? Just about that. And some people are genetically are more rigid, and maybe they don't need as much, time at the bar, depending on what they have to do, right? What their job is and what the context of their activity is. So maybe you have to bias them a certain way in their training. And then there could be people that aren't very rigid at all, and we wish they were a little bit more rigid. But it may be a battle trying to get them there because, again, of their idiosyncrasies that may really take away their ability to move because they just don't handle it well. So yeah, it's very much individualized, and that's kind of, especially in terms of my business, what I focus on the most is, okay, what does this person need? How can I help this person the most? And like, how can I alter their exercises based off of continual assessments to make it fit for what they need in this moment.
You've been very clear about the individual nature of that process, in the sense that there is no blanket statement for everybody to kind of go by. But in your experience, having worked with many people in the private setting, people on the field as well, how do people usually come to losing that movement variability, and how then do you usually, what's the kind of the route to regain it after you've lost it one way or another?
Yeah, so I mean, the athletes are always trying to create they're always battling gravity, right? They're going against gravity as hard as they can to try to overcome it. So inherently they're going to create force and adaptations that are going to bias them a certain way. So that's kind of one aspect right there. Another one is where genetics, and in particular skeletal structure that biases you towards being a little bit more rigid potentially, or not. So that could be another one. And then like the shape of that skeletal structure could, again, make you not as good to your skeletal structure may not help you battle gravity as well as someone else's, right? So there's literally a lot of genetics behind this, and there's this different thought. I mean, I remember when I was getting into this, I read Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck, and I was just like, oh man, everyone can get better, right? And that's what I think all coaches kind of think to some degree. And it's so true that everyone can get better, but they have to do it much different ways. And then they all have much different floors and ceilings is a big piece. So yeah, a lot of this rigidness comes from just being an athlete. Some of it comes from just who their mom and dad was, and the fact that they are, especially like I have, some middle-aged clients that I have some that weren't athletes at all, but because of their, if you want to call it their build or body shape, and the way they've been trying to handle just going through life and activity over the years, it created, actually, I have some that have very severe rigidity and things we've tried to undo as if they were an athlete. Like some of the people I see at Northeastern or that have played sports their whole lives. So it really, again, it just really, really depends. But there's always multiple variables involved in it. But the big ones are, what activities are you doing? And then what is your particular genetics and body shape?
Do
and how
you
you
find,
battle gravity.
is there any connection? I've seen that anecdotally, obviously, and not with the same detail that you have with that framework, because I didn't possess that at the time. I still don't. I'm starting to kind of grasp at a few straws to get my feet wet. But kind of type A personality, people that have a lot of responsibilities at work, a very stressful environment. And I've usually found that these people working with them, even in the private setting, even if they weren't doing much sports outside, they're going to come in, like you said, really rigid and lacking a lot of range of motion. Do you find that as well?
I do, and that's like the stuff you're talking about is like the stuff I find interesting, like really interesting, because the body and the mind, there's a connection. Am I an expert in that? I am not. I just know it's all connected. But I definitely see certain things like you kind of just alluded to, and some of them make sense. Like if you're a really rigid person, that means that your muscles as a whole, we'll just kind of give a generalization, are a little bit more concentrically biased. Your muscles are a little bit more concentrically biased. That means that you don't utilize oxygen as well as someone that isn't, right? So you're not as aerobic. Again, these are all degrees. And that means you're going to be biased a little bit more towards short-term energy system use. Well, if you're biased towards short-term energy system use, you create certain types of byproduct, in particular things like hydrogen ion, and that goes into bloodstream, and that brings fluid volume back to your heart, and that increases your heart rate, right? There's more fluid going to your heart rate increases. So if your heart rate increases, autonomically, your heart rate variability changed. So now autonomically, you are different. Like you were just from having a more rigid physiology in terms of your muscle position, like muscles, right? You are automatically more sympathetic on an autonomic scale from that aspect. So that is going to affect everything in your system, right? Like it's going to affect everything from all your other subsystems and the way you think and like the way you're saying, probably even the way you act. And then like you're saying, like, did that come first for some people? Probably. But then I can't measure it, but I'm sure there's some other aspect from the top down that does something very similar that you're saying. Because I definitely see those type A people and it's like a chicken or the egg. Was it type A driving it or was the body driving it? Was it both, right? But there's something there. And then I've seen certain patterns like that. It's just hard for me to say exactly what they are, but I see things like that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned energetics in there, and it made me think of something that Evan Pycon, I don't know if you're familiar with him from Training Think Tank, talks about. He works a lot with the Moxie and with all the conditioning work, and he often says that the kind of the top level athlete games or top level games athletes, sorry, in CrossFit, they usually display very low resting muscle tone. Like they have no resting, like barely any tension at all. And then if you talk about physiological limiters, they would be more biased towards a respiratory limitation rather than a delivery limitation versus other athletes that are more kind of bubble level regional athletes that carry a lot more tension and obviously don't do as well in the kind of in the volume that the game demands, for example, which would kind of go back to your point of the energetics playing into that muscle tension kind of idea.
Yeah, and then it's all connected because then we're starting to talk about repeatability again, right? And then we can start to see how these layers all overlap, and that's the type of stuff I find fascinating about this is when we start just connecting all the dots, and seeing a little bit more of how the puzzle. I mean, we'll never see the whole puzzle. I mean, it's too complex, but just getting a little more glimpse of it, and then all the different ways to intervene and create interventions that may change it, right? But then it's also slightly overwhelming because it's like, well, I don't know which intervention this person needs, right? I'm gonna try something because of our profession. We usually try something physical in a sense, right? But there's a chance that it's not, right? We just have, I think, a strong intervention strategy by doing, training, but there could be other things that are just blocking it, whatever it may be.
Yeah, and as part of that compression expansion model, obviously the breathing cycle comes in as a big player, probably one of the major players actually. So can you go a little bit into that and how talk about how the breathing cycle influences movement as such?
Yeah, I mean, the best way I try to picture it is if from your diaphragm down in your thorax, you're pretty much water, right? Like I think what 99% molecule is water from that point down, and then above that you're when your lungs fill, it's mostly air. So you're just a big fluid sac, right? Of inside, and you just happen to have um, bones in there to give you a little bit of shape. Um, but whenever you breathe and inhale, that diaphragm's pushing down on your guts and pushing it in a certain direction depending on the position you're in. And obviously, when you exhale, it goes back up, but then your guts move. So it greatly impacts again the shape of your body. And when you talk about inhaling, that's kind of this expansion, part of this expansion model, say. To create motion, and then exhaling is compression in the model. And there's only two ways for humans to fight gravity, and that is either to expand against it, like the inflatable tube guy you see at car washes, or it's to compress and squeeze, try to make something rigid, and compress and squeeze whatever you have left in you for fluid to make yourself rigid against gravity. So in my mind, it's just, again, it's the air is just more fluid in my mind about when I'm just trying to move it inside somebody and think about where I need to help push it to create motion, because you're going to go towards the fluid. Wherever the fluid goes, like that's the way you go. And then the compression is going to push the fluid there. So it just helps you think about how motion occurs in that essence.
Right. How does the gait cycle then come into play with whether you look at movement, exercise selection, all those things?
I think you can compare everything you do to the Gait cycle, because then again, then we have context and we see like where does this apply for what we want. So you could think about how, if you connect compression or expansion and compression to like what early or heel contact looks like, you have an idea of like, okay, that's where the body's positioned itself to do that. Then you can think about how it is at, if you want to call it mid stance, and then you can think about how it is at late to simplify it. And then based off that, you can see how people can actually get, if you will, stuck in some of those positions. And then you just gotta put the compression where you want to put the compression to push the expansion to kind of like undo it, to make it simply put. But that's everything. Like cutting is the Gait cycle. It's just, you want to call it lateral, right? Just lateral motion, but it's the same Gait cycle, and the same mechanics occur. So is rotational sports. If you talk about like a baseball pitcher or just a thrower in some aspect, it's still a Gait cycle in particular, because that's like going into a cut and out of a cut. It's the same mechanics over and over again. So again, going back to how I see a lot of exercises, I just see where people like, oh, that person's stuck in whatever early stance. I gotta push them off that. That's usually, they may have a part of the body stuck in early, or that person's stuck in late, and I gotta push them out of late back towards middle or back towards early. And again, you just have to assess to see what they need, and you kind of just put them there. That's what their training is about. It's now giving them what they're not getting. But that connects back to that whole aspect we talked about with the spectrum in terms of the force production and the motion, right? So they're stuck where they're stuck because they were trying to create force, right? And they may need that depending on what they do, right? So it comes back to like, okay, do I want to take this away? Maybe, or maybe I don't want to take it away for a part of a year, right? Maybe it's the early off season, right? Maybe try to take it away. But then you maybe want to promote it again as it gets closer to competition. And now we're actually talking about what, in my mind, is periodization. Like what do we want at what phase, right? But you can relate it back to the Gait cycle to see what they have access to. And you can use that to see like, okay, what is their movement variability? And then decide what you have to give them if you're trying to recapture that, or just make them use it more efficiently, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said change of direction is Gait. because it's true. It's from a global standpoint, not from a necessarily. In some respects it will apply, but others it won't. The when you when you touch down, right? That's going to be kind of a yielding action, and then you're going to have that mid stance, which is when nothing's moving virtually. That split second where you're kind of shifting from yielding to overcoming, and then you have that late stance, which is when you're pushing off, right? And so you have those kind of from a global perspective, not necessarily from like a local muscular perspective. Would that make sense?
Yeah, it always just depends where you want to look, right?
Right.
So as you're making contact with the ground, you need an overcoming strategy in certain spots because otherwise you'll like collapse to the ground.
Yeah.
Right. So that makes sense. So there's like this overcoming strategy to kind of slow you down a bit, and that's where we get into this play about like is a muscle eccentric or
Yeah.
concentric. But then, like you said, but then there's gonna be this certain yielding occurs after that in a certain area to help you lower into the cut, and then there's gonna be an overcoming strategy at a certain spot to teach you to come back out of the cut and transition. And then the other side of the body is essentially doing the opposite, right? And that's what I mean. And it's about creating this transition that is a smooth transition to prevent. I know a lot of times that when I was, growing up, we were calling it energy leaks, right? Where you see those things, that those weird things occur.
Inefficiencies, or would you call them that?
Yeah. Again, I always think about that person. I mean, you've seen people, those again, the aircraft carrier turning type athletes, or the ones that go into a cut, maybe look pretty damn good going into the cut, but they pop straight up. They can't come out at that angle. And I'm sure Justin Moore talked about that. He did a great presentation I saw early into this COVID thing on that. But those things are probably, or those are the things that you're looking for to see what they need. But that's still just like gait cycle. It's just in a little bit different context, and the degrees of it change than if you're just walking straight ahead or even sprinting straight ahead.
Yeah, it's definitely that model needs some digging into, because it's very interesting, and like you said, it connects a lot of dots from a lot of different realms of say call it physical preparation, which I think makes it very, very interesting, at least to give it a fair shot, dig into it and understand it, to see how it maps on everything that one actually understands. So you talked about Bill as being one of your primary influences. What have been your other big influences as a coach in the industry since you started?
Oh, I mean, the biggest one, and I'll whenever I ever get a chance, I'll promote him, is Brajesh Patel. He's the head strength conditioning coach at Quinnipiac University. Like, he's the guy. I am what I am because of Brajesh Patel. I went there as an early 20-year-old. I forgot what I was, 22, 23 maybe, as an internship. And again, I remember walking in, and immediately, I thought I knew something, and I didn't know shit, but I thought I knew something, right? Because you're just a young guy that thinks he knows something because you're in a weight room, or because you have a degree, or you maybe helped a few people. And then I was talking to him, and just seeing how he has connected so many different avenues of knowledge. And then like I see how this dude has in his office has a bookshelf, a full bookshelf, all these books. And again, I'm 23. I read a few books, but at that moment, it was literally an oh shit moment. I was like, oh shit. Like, I want to be something like this dude. He is way more advanced than me. But so he definitely got me into, like, now I'm like a geek. Oh, I read all the time. I rarely watch TV, but like, he's the guy that started to create that habit. And then he's the guy that kind of sparked my interest in connecting. I call it connecting the dots, like connecting all these different pieces of information to make a model that seems to be as coherent as possible to understand what we can about it, right? But he's the one that helped me really start thinking that way, because he was doing something like that. And this is, again, 15 years ago or so. I know he still is too, but that's the point. Like, he's the guy that did that. He's the guy that built my confidence to lead teams, like, group sessions, because he's throwing me in the fire. He's the guy that always made time for me at the end of a day to ask, literally told me to ask questions, right? Not like, do you have questions? Like, no, what questions do you have? Like, again, starting these conversations. So he's probably the biggest influence there is on me in this field.
You talked about, being influenced by him as to kind of push you to start reading more. I'm sure you've read hundreds of books by now, but if you had to pick 2 or 3 that stick out for you, that really maybe not even shifted the way that you saw things, but just just had a really potent effect on how you saw the world as a whole.
Yeah, the big one that popped in my head over the last few years was Anti-Fragile.
Okay, Nassim
Like
Taleb.
Taleb.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, the last 5-6 years I've been really getting into like complexity theory, complex systems theory, and it just was one of those things where it was like the perfect time to like read that and just fit in. So like really, I could see how I used it in terms of this model that I think of in terms of people, if you want to call it being fragile or anti-fragile, which is, he would hate this. It's not really resilient, but along those lines of what resiliency is. But that, and then that one in terms of just how you see the world and how you see a lot of information that's kind of put out there, and a lot of the the way society is designed and how certain bureaucracies are structured. But again, this makes you really think, and I mean, I think in a good way, question certain things even more than maybe I was before. But I love that book. I love that book. So that one, holidays, the obstacles away. Again, just having that mentality of, essentially the obstruction of the path is the path, right? And that means you have to go that way. So I love that book. I've read that one a few times. It just makes you think. It gives you that mindset that I think is so important. That's one. A book I've been recommending to people read is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I read that. It's just one of those books that, again, I think puts you in perspective about like what life really is, and what you want to do, what you want to do with things, and what you want to do with your life, right? Yeah. So that's a really good book. Lately, again, since I've been the last few years, I'm kind of tweaking my model a bit, learning a little bit more about biotensegrity. The book is literally called Biotensegrity by Graham Scarr. Okay. But again, just helps you understand and wrap your head a little bit more about how this connection of the whole body can work, and then taking physics and explaining how physics can explain how this can be, right? So that's a kind of more of a science book I thought of, or I could think of recently. Those are the ones that are off the top of my head.
I think it's a solid list. You talked about, being a young gun coming in hot and thinking you knew a few things.
I think that's still the case, Sean. So
as long, well, I like the phrase of once you get comfortable, or once you think that you know enough, then you need to change jobs, right? It's like, as long as you have that mindset, then you're good to keep going in whatever you're doing. The day you're like comfortable, no, I know enough, I'm good. Then you gotta hang your hat up and just go do something else.
That's right.
What are some of the things that you've kind of completely shifted, either like full 180 or even just a little bit on what you thought before was a certain way, and then how you see it now? Like if you kind of, maybe there wasn't Twitter back then, or you weren't using it, but if you'd like written a tweet out on a certain topic, and today the tweet would be the complete opposite. Could you think of any of those?
Oh man, it's funny. I literally think I'm like ashamed of shit I told people to do like a few months ago sometimes. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm always just trying to learn more. But I mean, the big one, and it's probably being a dead horse, is at this time, we thought, or at least I thought, I'm not gonna say we, I thought there was these imbalances, or there was issues why people couldn't do certain things or get into certain positions or whatever, and it was a strength issue, right? But it's not necessarily, and most likely not, a strength issue. It's probably a position issue that allows you to not, again, create the right muscle action or right muscle action at the right time. So like that's a big one. Like I mean, I'm sure I've done a lot of harm in my mind, the way I think now compared to then, by trying to squat people a certain way, or do whatever. Probably a little bit more square peg around hole type thinking then. So that's a big one. Like just that, literally, no, you don't just have to get stronger. There could be something else going on here. And not only just that, I may have to take away some of your weight room strength. Like I may have to take some of it away. I may have to help you take some of it away, I should say, because that's literally what you may need. And as a guy, I'm nowhere near what I used to be in terms of like weight room numbers, but like that was a big thing for me. Like I have shedded pounds of muscle to help me move better again. And eventually I'm gonna try to play with some things. But my point is like that is a thing. Like some people are gonna have to be like, nope, I don't care what your bench number is. Like we have to drop it back. If your goal is health, repeatability, again, being able to respond again along these lines to some degree, maybe you have to give up a little bit, or maybe you have to give up a lot. I don't know, but like that's the biggest one over the last few years. I mean, I remember all along, and I'm probably a little bit behind. I imagine right now is that the energy system stuff is always changing.
Yeah.
It seems to some degree. Again, I just think of it now in terms of this model. What too much compression can do, but I know there's more to it out there. I got to dig deeper into it a bit, but I know that's changed a bit as I've been in this field, right? Where early on, I mean, I remember right back then, it was still all about intervals, right? Like you just did intervals, and there was a huge push against any type of longer stuff, right? Whereas now, again, I have people where I want their heart rate super low as they pedal lightly on that bike at times. Again, just trying to find out what they need.
Yeah.
So like that's when I know it's changed, and I know it's going to continue to change once I look into it some more. Hopefully, going forward. Let's see what some other ones. The sprinting stuff, I mean, always kind of changed, but I think it's all this comes back to that whole force thing about like how much they want them to have. But yeah, the biggest ones were the strength and the energy system development I could think of. I do think a little bit in terms of the way I coach a little bit now too. I think times are changing a bit, especially in the collegiate setting where, maybe being a little bit early on is being a little bit more rigid and, developing that culture, which I think is still very important. I'm not saying it's not. But you kind of can have like the consequence model of like, hey, you do this or this, type of thing happens. You can't do that shit anymore. And not only that, I don't think, I think you have to build, you always do build that respect, but you got to find different ways to build that respect with them besides just that. And there's this fine line between giving and take about like what they want and what they want to do, especially in a setting like the college setting, which is, if you really think about it, it's a weird setup because they're not totally there on their own, right? Like they're there because they want to go to school and play that sport, but like the fact that they're seeing you to do resistance training or sports or performance training, some of them would choose to do that, and some of them would choose to do that with you, but some of them wouldn't choose to do that, and some of them wouldn't choose to do that with you, right? So there's this very interesting dynamic when you have 25, 30 people in the room. And, I always just think of like a distribution curve and like how many are my all-inners versus the, they do it because they're those people that follow the rules type people. And then the other ones don't give a damn, right? And how do you interact with all that? So I think I try to meet people where they're at a little bit more in terms of like what they want to do to some degree by giving them like, oh, we're going to do whatever, a split squat. Here are some of the options. But then at the same part, it gets complex because like you may want to do this version, but like that's not what you need. So like how do we have that conversation that's really productive without using up everything? But that's what it is. But there's a lot of conversations, and I know I've been saying for years, sometimes you just got to talk and like let people talk things out, and you're going to use up a portion of your lift time to get through to some people, right? Or to at least come to a compromise at that setting. The private setting is much different because they want to be there. They're literally paying you money to be there. So like they believe in you, and there's a lot less of that for the most part, right? But those are always the interesting things I think of is just how to interact with them. And part of it's me getting older, right? And I probably don't connect quite as well with what they say as I did back then. But I think that's a big piece too. Is like how do you continue to evolve to deal with different generations and their upbringing, what they're looking for, and at the same time trying to let them know that this just has to be really specific to like what your needs are, and it doesn't always match up with what your wants are. And that's a very interesting back and forth.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like you said, I mean, as soon as you add more people to the mix, it becomes like infinitely more complex to dealing with it. And I like what you said, like the people that are there and they would be there even if they didn't have to. I was talking to another coach today, and we talked about that exactly. And he was asking, how do I deal with the guys? Because he's like in a preseason kind of phase with his rugby guys. And so he's given them a program to do and prepare. They only have like 3 weeks together before the first game when they come back. And this is really short. And so he was like, how do I get everybody to do the program before? And I'm like, you can't. You know, you're going to have that 25% that are going to be like doing the program, asking you for more. The 50% in the middle, they're going to be like, yeah, kind of doing it. And you got, 25, it could be less, it could be more, probably less, but I'll hope. But you always have the
Yeah.
people that, no matter how much you give, you're just not going to get anything back. It's just going to be a void. It's just going to pull everything into it, and you're not going to get anything back.
Yeah, like you said, it's just complex, and that's what the uniqueness of, again, dealing with that team setting is, and how do you just get through to a few more of them, right? Like, just get a few more on your side, and a lot of times I think it is, the athletes themselves. The best ones that I always think back, the best ones are like the culture of the team was just so goddamn good, right? That they just did it, and you have a part of that depending on how much you see them. You may see your teams more than I see mine, even, but like that. Like they just go like, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing. They don't always have to love it, but they kind of just know like this is a habit they have to get used to a little bit, at least of accomplishing. But yeah, it's interesting, and that's what's actually most interesting about every year that starts up. Is like, okay, the squad's different. Like, how is this going to go, right?
Yeah.
And then you can definitely see like some years they were just people that were brought in, and then from day one when they were freshmen, like you could see they make an impact. And it changes the dynamic, right, in there, because they're pushing or they're competing, and someone else has to feel like they have to step up now or whatever. But yeah, and then they're all constantly changing too. So maybe they're really good for you one year, and then maybe something bad happens in their life, or like who knows, or maybe vice versa. Maybe something good happens in their life, and they change for you at some point. But it's always just that finding that mix that works well, and I think the biggest part is spending the time to let them talk and we come to some type of compromise at times with some people, and then something that I've accepted a little bit more over the last few years is you can help some, but you're not going to help all, right? Like that's just at some point it comes to that. It's never going to be an absolute.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, going back to your point of communication, it's between the guys, between you and the guys within the coaching kind of staff. And I find that makes a massive difference when there is a disconnect. The guys might do fine together socially, but then on a deeper level, do they actually interact in that way? Are they able to sit down with their teammate and have a hard conversation, or have a heart-to-heart, or have something like that? Or is it kind of just surface level and throwing shit at each other and that kind of thing? And then between the staff as well, is there open communication? Can we actually voice their opinions? And I think that the more we can do that, I mean, I don't know, 10 seconds just popped back into my mind, but it is that system, that network of dots. Every person is a dot, and everything kind of moves together as a flow. And if there is no communication, there is no connection between the points. So you find yourself with big discrepancies close in space, which is not good if you want kind of a smooth, if you see kind of a wave kind of model, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, 100%. I couldn't agree more. It's so interesting. I mean, and I think as frustrating as it can be at times, it's also what keeps it very interesting, right? All the complexity in general is what I find most interesting about the job, whether it be that cultural interaction type aspect, or if it's actual. I mean, again, I would like to make an argument that some people are acting a certain way because of something their body is telling them, right? All the behaviors is emergent from everything that's interacting. So again, it's just can be fascinating when you step back and looking at it.
Yeah, it's that you saying it just made me realize how kind of versatile a feel it is, or how, like you said, complex or deep it is, because there is so many aspects to it, especially when you add the level of a team, where now you're talking about social interaction, talking about psychology, sociology, and all those things that come into play, and how we're wholly unprepared. I mean, personally, I just bought the NSCA book, read it for 2 months straight, and then I challenged the exam to get my CPT, and that's what I got. And then you get onto the world and you're like, okay, now I need to coach. How do I do this?
Yeah.
This is not what the book said.
no. And that's the perfect example of why, like, all right, we can have all the degrees and certifications we want, but you have to go taste it, right? You have to be out there and be a practitioner and experience lots of different things. And it'll start helping shape you in terms of what you believe, right?
Yeah, exactly. What are you hoping to see from all the things you see, maybe on social media or that you hear about in the performance world? What are you hoping to see more of in the next year? What are some kind of up and coming things or trends that you see that are positive and that you'd like to see more of?
It's tough. I actually I try to just go on social media a little bit because I try to just do my thing, get off because I don't want to be too involved in it. Besides, I guess marketing a bit, and it's keeping up with some people, and I'll be honest. I think the people I keep up with, I'm probably create too much of a bubble. You know what I mean? Like there are a lot of people that I kind of know, and they're probably maybe a little too similar to me. So that's actually one of my goals. Is I probably have to go find someone else that's saying some different things. That's probably a good goal for me. Um, but you know, it's to me, it's gonna be more and more how everyone's gonna integrate everything. Like how are we really trying to not think of this as a little piecemeal reductionist model that again I think it has been the background of it all. I mean, at least since I've been in it, like as far as I can tell, pretty much all along, and what the medical community in general has been biased towards, and keep going towards this model of like how do we integrate everything together to find what works for these particular scenarios. So I know there are really smart people out there, and they're gonna grab on and start connecting the dots way better than I can, and they're gonna start connecting energy systems better, or like psychology better, or what have you. Again, just looking at all these other subsystems, and then seeing how the movement can interact with them in some way. But I'd love to be able to see. Again, I don't know how to measure this thing I keep talking about between the movement variability, or I even call it like adaptability and force, but like how do we better manage that with some of these people? And I'm not sure if there is a way besides just the artistry of it, and more and more people jumping on board of kind of that model. But I just think that the going after performance numbers in general is just got something that's got to change to some degree, because it's not always going to be telling us the story we want to know, because those numbers can go up and then maybe that person's a worse whatever basketball player, soccer player, whatever it may be. So I guess it's more just the philosophy of it all that I hope is changing some, but again, I think it's more in my bubble than it is what's really out there. But again, I know there's gonna be some really smart people that start connecting some better dots in terms of best way to bring it all together.
What are some of the besides maybe finding how to say that, information sources outside your bubble, like you just mentioned, as being one of your kind of to-dos? What else is on your personal curiosity to-do list? Things you want to dig a little bit more into that you're not kind of not familiar with, but just that you're not as familiar with or as confident with as you would like to be?
Yeah. So I am going to kind of mention earlier, but I am going to go dig into the energy systems a bit, and then try to bring it back and connect it to a little bit more of the stuff I'm thinking, to be sure it's like up to date and coherent. So that's one. I mean, it's really more about like that type of concept. It's like, okay, if I'm thinking about this model, I just want to clean up how all these things that we've always talked about, whether it be plyometrics or like speed training or energy systems or what have you, how all of them kind of fit in. And again, I can articulate something cleanly about each one. Besides, I mean, the amount of motion you need for each one is a little different, but along those lines, like how's this fit in to create training? But at some point, again, this comes back to like how much force they need or not. But that's a big piece of it. I think everyone can always get better in the whole coaching aspect, kind of like our previous conversation, and connecting with people. And I think, that's something that as you get older, it should probably get better if you're putting thought into it, right? And interacting. So that's a big one. What else? I mean, those seem to be the big ones I had off the top of my head.
What would be your biggest advice for young coaches that are starting out and that have all the will in the world and want to do a good job? What would you recommend them doing?
They read and read broadly to get an idea of how things work and give you creativity and ideas. Find really good mentors, and sometimes you can find them, and sometimes they just kind of come about. But I guess that's your networking and who you're meeting, and you never know who you'll connect with and how that works. But again, that's those two right there are huge. And I know, again, when you actually sit back and think about how much they influence you and where you headed and how those things go, it's almost amazing how it helps build you in your path. And that's another one is, just because you have a vision, like maybe you want to be a collegiate strength coach or work professionally or whatever it is, that's good. And like, obviously it's going to drive you and do what you got to do. But once you get there and experience it, don't be afraid to change again. There's all types of quotes out there about change being literally essential in life, and it's 100% true. But being able to constantly adapt to your scenario, constantly adapt to what you're even feeling, or constantly adapting to what you think you need for you to keep striving and continue on your journey. Be open to change, and those opportunities to change don't necessarily just accept. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest things or maybe one of the saddest things I can think of in life is people that have dreams and visions about who they want to be or what they want to do, and then they come to that point where they think they accomplished some of it and they just settle and become complacent with it because of this, that, or the other thing. And I mean, I get it, but at the same time, how happy you're going to be, how good of a product are you going to put out if you're like, for lack of a better term, faking it, right? To like continue to do what you're doing rather than, maybe pivoting course, whatever degree, to find something that's a little bit more meaningful to you, and see where that goes, and then be ready to pivot again, right? Because that's how life is, right? That's how life is.
I think those are some fantastic closing words, man. It's been a pleasure getting to know you a bit, exchanging. Where can people find you on social media if they want to learn more about what you do?
Yeah, I'm at strategic_fitness_training. I put stuff up on Twitter at SFit Training, and Facebook, same thing, Strategic Fitness Training. That's where I put most of my content. I do, hopefully, trying to keep a very tight schedule of trying to put stuff out every day to see what people like, and open to suggestions about what people want to hear. I'm just looking forward to helping some people, and again, probably expanding this philosophy a little bit more and see what other people come up with when they start to learn and dig deeper into it.
I'll make sure I'll link all of those in the description of the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.